Good morning. I am Reverend Dr. Mark Boyea, the minister here at First Parish Church Congregational, and I once again welcome you to our Sunday morning time of reflection and remembrance and commemoration and celebration of God's presence and power and goodness and challenge and call for our lives. I welcome you here on the first Sunday of the season of Advent, that sacred season when we in the Christian community once again prepare ourselves to welcome, to celebrate, to once again commemorate the birth of Jesus, the coming of God's essence, the embodiment of God and God's ways coming to us for our sake, that enormous gift from God. First Parish Church Congregational here in beautiful Manchester by the Sea, Massachusetts. The congregational part of our name, symbolizing our long-standing tradition within Christianity of democratic governance and the full equality of all members of this spiritual community to participate in its life, which means that I welcome you to a place where no matter who you are or where you are on your life or faith journey, you are fully welcome. And so, in that vein, please let us know that you're here this morning if you haven't already, and let us know how we can reach you so that we can share with you the multiple ways and diverse ways that we have to assist your spiritual growth here at First Parish Church. So with all of that, I now invite you to join me in the lighting of the first Advent candle, the candle of hope. Let us share these words from Psalm 130. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in the Lord's word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord, more than those who watch for the morning. With the lighting of the candle of hope, we begin our Advent journey. We prepare once again for the coming of God's light into the world through Jesus. God's light brings hope, and where there is hope, there is light. I invite you to now join us in the singing of our opening hymn, Come, O Long-Expected Jesus, the words to which are in your online bulletin.
Come, the
I invite you now to join us in this morning's opening prayer, the words to which are also in your online bulletin. Holy One, we put our hope in you. Despite the difficulties, disappointments, and darkness in the world and in our lives, we place our hope in you and the one you will soon send us. And so we prepare this Advent season to open our hearts, minds, and spirits to welcome Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, into our lives. We prepare to welcome and share the hope he embodies. Hope when hope seems hardest or even lost. We promise this to you and each other, O God, as well as offer you now the words Jesus would one day teach his followers to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Oh come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Oh, come, desire of nations, bind all people in one heart and mind. Bid envy, strife, and quarrel cease. Fill the whole world with heaven's peace. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Oh come, Emmanuel. Oh come, Emmanuel. Oh come, Emmanuel. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come come to thee, O Israel, shall come to thee, O Israel, shall come to thee, O Israel. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come, O Israel.
Thank you, Paul. Just beautiful. So as we come to this morning's time of prayer, I ask you to once again continue to hold in your hearts and minds and spirits all healthcare workers and scientists, all first responders, all those who are so intimately involved with serving the needs of those suffering from COVID-19 and their families and friends and loved ones. Ask you to continue to hold your thoughts and your prayers, all teachers and students and school leaders as they continue to navigate their way through these uncertain times educationally, attempting to do the best they can for all of our students, college students on down to our youngest preschool kids. Also ask you to continue to hold in your thoughts and prayers, of course, all those throughout the world who continue to suffer from this pandemic, all those who have it directly, as well as all of their friends and families. And lastly, a couple of joys, a couple of things to celebrate. We did not have a prayer time last Sunday, so we missed saying happy birthday to Dana Powers, a member of this spiritual community. Dana's birthday was last week, and this coming week, in fact, tomorrow, we would like to send birthday wishes out to Annabelle Smith. So with all of those prayer intentions, those joys and concerns that we have already presented, I now welcome you to offer any others that you might have to our God. Either share them with those who you might be with, or simply offer them up to God in the silence of your hearts and minds. This morning's prayer is one adapted from a prayer written by John Bell of the renowned Iona spiritual community in Scotland. You keep us waiting, God of all time. You call us to wait for the right time to discover who we are, where we are to go, who will be with us and what we must do. And so we thank you for the waiting. You keep us looking, God of all space. You want us to look in all places for signs of hope, for people who are hopeless, for visions of a better world which will appear among the disappointments of the world we know. And so we thank you for the looking. You keep us loving, God, whose name is love. You want us to be like you. You want us to love the loveless and the unlovely and the unlovable, to love without jealousy or design or threat, and most difficult of all, at times, to love ourselves. And so we thank you for the loving. And in all this, you keep us. Through hard questions with no easy answers, through failing where we hoped to succeed, making an impact when we felt we were useless, through the patience and the dreams and the love of others, and through Jesus and his Spirit, you keep us. So thank you for the keeping, now and forever. Amen. Thank you, Herman. So now let us share these words from the 18th chapter of the book of Genesis. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So the men said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Then Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then Abraham took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before the men. And Abraham stood by them under the tree while they ate. The men then said to Abraham, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I've grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. But the Lord said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." Did Mary laugh too? Did Mary laugh the same way her earliest ancestor, Sarah, laughed? It is the very first instance in the entire Bible of laughter. Over the first 17 chapters of the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, we get creation and annihilation, light and dark, good and evil, crime and punishment, paradise gained and paradise lost, but no laughter. Until now. Until God pays a visit to a couple of wandering tent dwellers. Earlier in the book of Genesis, God had already visited those 2 same wandering tent dwellers, Abram and Sarai. God had visited them and called them to a vital role in God's story in the world. God calls Abram and Sarai to be the mother and father of a people whose sole purpose for being is to live in union with God and God's ways. The ancient Israelites, our Jewish spiritual ancestors. God promises Abram and Sarai that their descendants will be more numerous than the stars or the grains of sand on the earth. And in the process, God changes their names. to Abraham and Sarah. It is another biblical first, the first time that a vital call from God is associated with name change. God promises that Abraham and Sarah's descendants will be more numerous than the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the earth. But years go by, and not only do Abraham and Sarah not have descendants more numerous than the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the earth, they don't even have one. They have still not had a single child together. And they are getting older and older, to the point where, as we're told in this passage from the book of Genesis, and it's put rather delicately, I think, it is no longer in the manner of women for Sarah. But, to be fair, it's likely also no longer in the manner of men for Abraham either. Imagine the disappointment, the discouragement, how deep it must have been over God's promise unfulfilled. But then, as Abraham and Sarah are encamped at a place called Mamre, a place between Hebron and Jerusalem in ancient Israel that in that time and place was considered to be a sacred site, as they are encamped at Mamre, three men approach. Abraham, consistent with ancient practices of hospitality, goes out to greet them. But Abraham doesn't just go. He runs to greet them. And that tells us something. See, it was pretty unusual in the ancient world for an adult man to run. It was considered undignified. But Abraham runs to the three strangers. It is the beginning of another biblical first. The institution of not just God's call that we offer hospitality to the stranger, but extravagant hospitality. Abraham runs to the three strangers, bows down to the ground, another sign of honor, and says, "Lord, if you have found favor with me, stay for a while. I'll give you a little water, a little bread. You can refresh yourselves." The word we see as Lord there is actually in the Hebrew is plural, because there's three men. And the Lord that we see is also lowercase Lord. It's a sign of general honor to a guest, not an indication that Abraham knows it's God, because Abraham doesn't. But we do. We know that it is God, accompanied by two members of what earlier in Genesis is called the heavenly court. In the first creation story, we are told at the beginning that God is not alone in the universe when he creates the earth and humanity. God is accompanied by a heavenly court. Other spiritual beings whose purpose is to serve God. Beings that would come over time to be known as, we refer to them now, angels or spiritual messengers. Abraham continues the process of extravagant hospitality. He runs again, this time to Sarah, says, "Get 3 measures of flour and knead it and make some bread." But that word measures in Hebrew is a word called seah. And depending upon the source you're reading, 3 seahs is the equivalent of anything from 22 quarts to 28 cups to 36 pounds of flour. Now, I'm no baker, but my guess is you can make more than just a little bread with that much flour. Abraham and Sarah and Abraham's servant put together not just a little bread, but a full-course feast of hospitality. And then Abraham stands by as the guests eat ready to serve them if needed. We're not told much about the dinner conversation. My guess is it was probably the usual: the weather, sports, how it was a crime of the century that one of their favorite singers didn't win that season's The Voice. But then the men ask Abraham, "Hey, where's your wife?" Beg your pardon? "Where's your wife, Sarah?" Just inside the tent. They're not asking because they want to meet or talk to Sarah. They're asking to make sure that she can hear them. Because then one of the members of that heavenly court will say to Abraham, in due season, which in biblical terms means about a year. In due season, about a year from now, Abraham, I'm going to look you up again, wherever you might be, and have a visit with you and Sarah and your new son. Abraham doesn't respond. He is understandably either didn't hear correctly or dumbfounded by what he has heard. But Sarah, inside the tent, Sarah laughs. We're told she laughs to herself. But that doesn't necessarily mean she laughs silently. Because I don't know about you, but there have been a lot of times in my life where I have laughed to myself out loud. She laughs. But I'm going to have a child now when I'm this old and Abraham is this old? But whether it was silently or out loud, God, of course, hears Sarah laugh. God asks Abraham, well, why did she laugh at that declaration that you and her are going to have a child in a year? Again, Abraham doesn't say anything. But Sarah denies having laughed. A perfectly understandable human response. She wants to save face. Maybe she's embarrassed. So she says, no, I didn't laugh. But of course, our God, as we know, is not one for a lack of honesty or self-knowledge. He won't let that pass. God says, well, yeah, you did laugh. But why? Why did Sarah laugh? Well, the most readily apparent reason is dismissiveness, almost the ridiculousness of the declaration that she has heard. She just finds it preposterous, impossible that she's still going to have a child with Abraham. And so she laughs out of that. But as we know, just as in English, the word laugh has many different connotations. It is the same in Hebrew. The word for laughter in Hebrew has a number of different connotations. And so the rabbis over the centuries have debated just why she laughed. Maybe it was out of dismissiveness, but others have suggested it might have been out of derision. She was scoffing, a scoffing that is rooted in that deep disappointment and discouragement, maybe even anger she felt over God's promise having gone unfulfilled in her life. Maybe. Or maybe, as others have argued, she laughs as a defense mechanism. Self-defense, making what had become intolerable for her at least a little bit more tolerable. Viktor Frankl, the renowned psychiatrist, in talking about his experiences in 2 of Nazi Germany's death camps, says, If I hadn't been able to laugh, I would not have been able to survive. Laughter is what made it possible for intolerable circumstances to be lifted up just enough to be bearable. But let me suggest another possibility for why Sarah laughs. Because she is afraid. Because she's afraid. Neuroscientists tell us that one of the reasons people laugh is as a response to stress or anxiety or conflict or fear. And we know that Sarah's afraid. We're told she's afraid, but we're told she's afraid after God hears her laugh. The sense being that she becomes afraid because she got found out, she got caught laughing. But let me suggest that maybe she was already afraid. Afraid of the possibility. Afraid of the possibility that God's promise would, in fact, come true in her life. Afraid of the impossible possibility of God's promise coming true for her and for Abraham and for their descendants. Since we've been talking about firsts in the Bible this morning, I'll mention another first, this Thanksgiving Day. I played a word game called Ditto Ditto for the very first time. I had never even heard of Ditto Ditto. Maybe you have not either. If you haven't, it is a word game in which there are a series of categories presented. And after each category, players have 10 seconds to write down 2 responses that fit that category. But keeping in mind that you get points for every time one of your responses matches somebody else's response. And whoever ends up with the most points at the end wins. Well, one of the categories in this first ever game of Ditto Ditto I played on Thanksgiving Day was things people are afraid of. And of course, as you would expect, the players put down the usual suspects: spiders, snakes, the dark, death, the normal sort of tangible ones, common ones that we think of in our lives. But throughout the centuries, philosophers and psychologists and spiritual leaders have also told us time and time again that there is another set of fears that humans experience. Existential fears. For instance, the fear of loss of control, the fear of not being noticed, the fear of not mattering. And I would suggest the fear of the possible. The fear that we, in spiritual terms, the spiritual existential fear that we could, in fact, actually become all of what God created us to be and calls us to be individually and together. The fear that we could give birth to a life and legacy, a descendancy of living in union with God and God's ways, a life and legacy of compassion and forgiveness and mercy and justice. That we could, in fact, as those later members of the heavenly court, the angels, who appeared to the shepherds in Luke's gospel on the night of Jesus' birth, that we could, as they told the shepherds, know peace on earth and goodwill toward God's people. I think sometimes we are afraid, maybe even much more afraid, of the possible than just about anything else. That what is possible, what we are truly capable of, scares us more than what is. Because what is even if we're disappointed, discouraged by it, it's there. We know it. It's comfortable. So I wonder if Mary laughed too. I wonder if Mary laughed just like Sarah laughed when she was presented with her impossible possibility from God. When she was presented with the impossible possibility that at the complete opposite end of the biological spectrum, as just a young girl who was a nobody, she would be the mother of the embodiment of God with us. We don't get a sense that she laughs. We don't get a sense that she laughs. Mary's response is to instead embrace that impossible possibility. She questions, she asks about it, she wonders about it, but she doesn't laugh. She fully embraces it. But to be fair, Mary had a Gabriel, and Sarah didn't. Before Gabriel presents Mary with that impossible possibility, Gabriel says this first: don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. The first thing Gabriel does is help allay any fear Mary might have of the possible. No one did that for Sarah. So as we enter this Advent season, this time in our lives when there is so much discouragement and disappointment that we are dealing with, do not be afraid, my friends. Do not be afraid. Instead, like Mary, embrace the impossible possibility that God is presenting to us. God coming into the world like one of us for us. Let us embrace it. Because in due season, God's promise to Sarah was fulfilled. Sarah and Abraham had that child. In due season, God's promise to Mary was fulfilled. Mary became the mother of God with us. And in due season, God's promise to us will be fulfilled as well. And that, my friends, is no laughing matter. Amen.
Did you know that your baby boy would someday walk on water? Mary, did you know that your baby boy would save our sons and daughters? Did you know that your baby boy has come to make you new? This child that you delivered will soon deliver you. Mary, did you know that your baby boy will give sight to a blind man? Mary, did you know that your baby boy will calm a storm with his hand? Did you know that your baby boy has walked where angels trod? When you kissed your little baby, then you kissed the face of God. The blind will see, the deaf will hear, the dead will live again. The lame will leap, the dumb will speak, the praises of the Lamb. Mary, did you know that your baby boy is Lord of all creation? Mary, did you know that your baby boy will one day rule the nation? Did you know that your baby boy was heaven's perfect lamb? This sleeping child you're holding is the great I
Thank you, Rebecca. These three are terrific, aren't they? I'd like to thank you once more for joining us this morning here at First Parish Church Congregational in Manchester by the Sea, Massachusetts, for this time of reflection and remembrance and celebration of God's presence and power and goodness and challenge and call and promise for our lives, especially as we enter this sacred season of Advent. And again, if you haven't had the chance to let us know you were here, please do so. It's not too late, and if you're part of the First Parish community, I hope that you will join us for some time of virtual friendship in just a few moments. So now, my friends, it is time for us to leave this sacred space and go out into the world unafraid. Unafraid to embrace the impossible possibility of God's call, of God's promise for us. The promise that we can become all that God created us to be and calls us to be individually and together. The promise that we can live a life and leave a legacy of compassion and forgiveness and justice and mercy. The promise that we can know peace on earth, goodwill toward all God's people. And for that promise, we say thanks be to God. Amen.